Good evening, everyone. Hope you're well. We are again another live session. My name is Manda, and that is Dominic. We are from Kitchen Collective Coaching. We coach hospitality owners and operators for running more profitable venues. And speaking of profitable, that is something that we're speaking about today as well, which is very, very important. And Dominic, some crazy news today, obviously, with some numbers in New South Wales. Most of us are in lockdown. Pretty intense times, I guess, with most hospitality venues around the country, especially on the East Coast. And as much as I guess we're trying to get away from having conversations about COVID and what we need to get away from it, it seems to be coming back and back again. So we have been talking with our clients for months now, and I think we have just come up with the perfect recipe that we would love to share with you, because I think it's absolutely important right now that if you follow some of the topics and the points that we're speaking of today, you'd be far ahead than if you don't actually have any plans in place. So the topic obviously is how to run a profitable hospitality venue during lockdown. Now, we're going to walk through 5 steps on exactly what you would have to do for it, and see every venue is going to be different. However, if you apply the rules on what we're talking about or the concepts that we're talking about, you will be in a much better place. Yeah, and that's what we are. And we're saying this based on the results that we've had with some of our clients. In fact, some clients have actually been down 50-60% in revenue, yet they've actually made more profit than they were before. And I know it sounds crazy, but it's because of certain ideas and certain processes that we've actually put in place, where we're focused on actually making sure that the number at the end, which is profit, is actually healthy, and that's where the entire focus has been. So what do the 5 steps actually look like? And before we get into that, just want to do a shout out to our live viewers. Thank you guys for jumping on, and if you're watching this on the rebroadcast, if there are any questions, just pop them down and we'd love to answer them, and we'll get to them in the next 24 hours or so. But it would be really good to understand your views. What is it that helped? What is helping you in lockdown right now, or some of the challenges that you have in lockdown that you'd like us to answer, and would love to sort of hear your thoughts on that as well. And at the end, if you do find this video helpful, absolutely share it to your network, share it to those who might feel that it's going to be necessary for them, even if it's going to be 1 or 2 things that you get out of this. Hopefully they could get the same out as well. So let's dive straight in. So we are speaking of 5 areas or 5 rules that you would have to get started off with, and I'm just going to throw this out on the screen so you can look at what these rules are. And we'll sort of walk through each of them individually, but the summary of it is going to be: rule number 1 is you're going to start looking at your current business model. You're going to start looking at your current break-even number, because it's definitely changed from where it used to be, and you're going to have to pivot to make the numbers work, right? So this is high level, this is strategy, this is business model. What am I actually doing to make the numbers work? So that's number 1. From there, we're going to go in and speak about labor models, right? And again, the reason these actually process a step 1 by 1 is literally you've got to follow the step from rule 1 to rule 2 to rule 3, all the way down, and you'll actually get to the result that we're after. Yeah. So rule number 2, again, we're going to look at your labor model. What does it that you can actually afford right now, and how do you actually make that work? Rule number 3 is going to be looking at your menu, looking at what is it that you can produce out of your kitchen, out of your venue, given most venues right now are in takeaway models only. From there, we're going to get into renegotiating your rental obligations, and lastly, but most importantly as well, look at your overhead costs, right? So it's a clear 5-step process and what this looks like. I think we need to get started with where the strategy sits, right? Because strategy is, well, everything right now, because we've had to pivot. We've had to pivot over the past 18 months, and we are having to pivot now more than ever, because of what's happening with the lockdown situation. So Dominic, would love to know what you reckon is going to be the perfect pivot right now, in regards to your number 1, which is your strategy, and how is it that businesses and business owners need to start thinking from a profitability or break-even standpoint?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a great question. Just a reminder again, if you are, thank you for joining. If you just jumped on, we are talking about how to run a profitable venue in lockdown. And as Madar mentioned earlier, that concept might be a little crazy for some people, but I can tell you it is actually possible. All of our clients are running either profitable or very near profitable venues at the moment through the strategies that we're actually going to cover for you today. So watch very carefully, watch very closely. If you're watching on the replay, again, just hit replay in the comments section. We'd love to see who's live and who's watching on the replay. But if you do have questions as well, drop them in the comments section. If we don't get to them right now, we will obviously be answering those over the coming days if you're watching that. But thank you for joining as well. And as Madar said, if you find this useful, please share it, because everyone is most people are in a world of hurt at the moment, obviously because of the extended lockdowns that we're going through in Australia. And we're seeing that obviously happen around the world as well. One thing I will say actually before we start is that these strategies we actually teach all of our clients, and they apply to businesses in lockdown as much as out of lockdown. It's exactly the same process. The difference is, in lockdown, we're quite often looking at finite resources, particularly being revenue. That is a finite resource. There's only so much money coming into the business, and often that's 20, 30, 40, 50%, or even more. That businesses are doing less than what they did previously. They're 50% down in revenue, and so how do you manage a business when with an existing cost base that's based on maybe doing 20 grand a week and you're now only doing 10,000 in revenue? So we talked about this actually a couple of weeks ago in a previous video around the concept of break even. We kind of walked through the steps about how you do that. But essentially, to get to that point, what we need to start with, as Madar mentioned, is we need to start with the business model itself. And it's fair to say for most people, the business model that they had, pre-lockdown, I won't even say pre-pandemic because that was for too long ago, but pre-lockdown is, for most venues, it's based on a certain number of people dining in. You got 20, 30, 40, 50 seats or more. And so your average check, the menu mix and everything is all based around how many people you've got dining in, as well as a portion of takeaway business. And for most people, that's gone out the window. Is we're now looking at only being able to do takeaway for most businesses, certainly in Australia, but also around the world. If you do have dining capacity in some states or some areas, it's very, very, very limited. But also that the range of products that you're selling is geared towards takeaway. And then we take into account the third-party delivery apps like Uber and Deliveroo and Menulog and what have you, and that changes the whole financial model as well. So understanding what your business is now based on compared to what it is before is the first really critical step. If you are trying to operate like a non-lockdown business, I would say, where your numbers are based on an average check that you had before with the same profit margin you had before, chances are you're losing money. And so the first thing we need to look at is, well, what does that business model look like? And when we talk about business model, there's a few things that we need to do, which is say we start with the end in mind. What is our actual revenue that we've got to work with? But where do you need to be? What kind of profit do you need to have? And this is where something like the break-even model really comes into play. And we did talk about this a couple of weeks ago in a break-even calculator that we've now got on our website. So if you go to our website, kitchencollectivecoaching.com.au, you'll actually see in the tools section there's a little calculator there that will help you actually work out what your business model needs to be to break even. And by business model, I'm talking about what costs you've got to work with, what your labor cost needs to be, what your COGS need to be, etc., for you to actually just break even or even make a profit. So understanding what your numbers are is really quite critical. The thing with the reason we start with the end in mind is often what you've been doing is you've been running a venue and you've been running your business based on, I'll just keep selling what I'm selling, and I'm selling so much coffee a day or so many meals a day or so many burgers or whatever your product range is, and I either end up in profit or I don't. And that's okay if you've been running for a period of time and you finally drilled down all of your costs to make sure that you're profitable at the end. But if you've got a sudden drop in revenue, that calculation's gone out the window, as I said. So what you need to do is actually start with the end and say, well, what profit am I aiming for? And then what do all of the costs need to look like given the current revenue that I've got? Because if revenue is a finite resource and we want to make profit, it's what happens in between that, which is what's really critical. And so when we get into things like the labor percentage, the labor percentage needs to be a certain percentage of our current revenue to make sure that we're still profitable. It can't be the same cost. It needs to be relative to the percentage. And Mandar's going to talk about labor in a second. But that's where we go from the business model. It's about mapping out what the business model needs to look like, what it costs for each of the different areas of the business, be it labor, cost of goods, your rent, and your overheads. What do all of those figures need to look like for you to actually achieve profit? And so with all of our clients, again, for us to get to break even, or actually, as I say, profitable, and what's really interesting actually is that the businesses that we've been working with that weren't profitable pre-lockdown have actually managed to make profit during lockdown with substantially lower revenue. And the reason for that is we put a really strong focus, certainly over the last couple of months, around profit is the aim of the game. And so to get to profit, these are the things that we need to do. We need to make some drastic changes, and this is the business model that you need to run. And the last thing I will say is, as much as we talk about this is about getting you to a profitable business, even with substantially less revenue, it's not always going to be about profit. Now, your business model, when you put this into either using our calculator or looking at it yourself, be it your rent, be it the fact that you need to carry a certain amount of staff to keep servicing your customers, that you're only able to do a certain amount of product, that you're in areas where there might be a curfew, you may only have a very small amount of revenue coming in, and you're actually going to have a loss. But the thing when we're looking at that is, what we want to see is that the loss is the lowest amount possible. And I would say it's actually okay sometimes to run a budgeted loss as long as we know that's the lowest number that it needs to be. And so we aim for profit, but sometimes, as I say, it's actually okay. If we're only losing $200 a week and you're in a month-long lockdown, it means at the end of that month, we only have lost $800. We can climb out of that hole on the other side of this. You know, it might be more for some businesses. We certainly do see businesses where we might be talking a $300 to $500 a week loss. But then by the time we get out of that, it's only a few weeks or a month, and we've closed that gap again. So it is okay. You know, obviously we're really driving towards profitability, but it is absolutely okay to run at a loss if we understand that that's the lowest number possible. So just again, to cover that, what we just talked about is, you know, we want to start with the end in mind, understand what the outcome is that we're looking for, and then how do we need to get there. We're going to look at the current revenue and we work backwards from that. What does a business model need to look like to achieve break even? And as I mentioned before, it's not always about making profit. So moving on, we're going to look at the labor. And Mandar, you want to talk to us about the labor control here?
Yeah, absolutely. No, thanks, Dom. And yeah, it all starts with, you know, where your business model is. How is it that we pivot? And once you've done that, so that's absolutely vital in regards to doing anything forward. You start with, you know, with the end in mind. And then once we have done that is when we start talking about labor, and we start speaking about how is it that labor is going to drive this forward, right? And just exactly with what Dom said, you know, what is it with the end in mind? Now that we know where the business model is or where it needs to be, you've worked out what your labor sort of, where your budget is for your labor, right? Now, the calculator that Dominic has mentioned that we have on our website, kitchencollectivecoaching.com.au, will tell you exactly what you can afford with that labor model, right? Because you've put in your revenue that's coming in right now. It has broken down and told you exactly this is what your labor percentage or labor cost is, and then what dollars are you actually allowed to allocate towards labor. So with labor, we are working this backwards. Remember, we're starting this backwards. So with labor, you've got your allocated number. You know exactly what the number is that you need to achieve. And that number now suddenly needs to then be converted into your labor hours, right? So what does the dollar value, let's assume you've got $5,000 in labor spend. What does that mean in regards to hours? And see, every business is going to be different. You'll be having a different cost per man hour. And in regards, if you want to find out exactly what total hours you can actually allocate, you can jump on to the second tool that we have on our website, which is a labor calculator. And again, kitchencollectivecoaching.com.au tools, and you'll find the labor calculator just next to the break-even calculator. So in there, once you pop in what your budget is, it can spit out exactly what your hours or allocated hours are. And now that you've got those hours, your next step is to try and work those in your weeks that you're open. So let's assume that you're trading 7 days a week. So over those 7 days, what hours need to be allocated on what day? Now, certain days would be busier than the others. So just be really smart about what days receive or require a certain number of hours. So then you're allowed to know what menu you're allowed to actually produce, right? Which actually gets me to the next point, which is around how your hours are allocated is going to allow you to produce the menu you're going to produce. So it's really thinking this backwards. It's not the other way around. It's not that we've got our menu and now what do I require to produce that menu? Because what mostly happens is you would end up having all these labor hours that's required for that menu or servicing a certain menu where the labor model doesn't make sense, the business model doesn't make sense, and you end up just being in a hole, right? So this is really re-engineering, reverse engineering what the menu needs to look like based on the budget that you've got. So it's exactly rethinking that. So again, we're looking at what is the break even, what does that allow us to give us in regards to a budget for our labor, looking at the labor, putting it on a calculator, working out exactly what hours you are allowed to operate your restaurant, your cafe, your venue, and then from there working out what is it that you can produce off the kitchen based on the labor hours that I have. Yeah. So just putting that again into 4 different points. Refer to the break-even calculator and work out what you can afford. From there, you convert the dollars into the hours. Again, refer back to our labor calculator that we have in our tools section. It will tell us what the total hours are, and then your next step is now to spread those hours across the week. Certain days requiring more hours than others. And then lastly is designing a menu that you can work with the allocated labor hours, right? So anything more than that, then we're really breaking the labor model and we're breaking the business model. And it sort of gives us the understanding of, all right, so now this is what menu I can produce. And from there, you move on to the menu, which is the next step, which is the next rule, which is rule number 3, which Dom's going to just tell us exactly about how do we keep it simple, how do we actually make that work with the current labor model.
Yes, thanks, Madar. So as Madar mentioned, looking at the menu is really critical. There's a couple of things when we talk about the menu, again, different to what we do outside of a lockdown or outside of, I wouldn't say outside of pandemic, but certainly outside of a lockdown to what we do in lockdown. A couple of assumptions that we're going to make is that during lockdown, most businesses are takeaway only. So what sells in takeaway versus what sells in dine-in, vastly different. And I've had chats with a lot of people over the last month or so around their breakfast menu not performing. And a lot of breakfast menus are geared towards sit-down breakfast. It might be a big breakfast or pancakes or waffles or avocado toast or something like that just isn't popular as a takeaway item. The one thing I will say as well, and I've mentioned to a lot of people, is the dining habits of consumers changes, particularly when they're working from home, is they're going to eat lunch out. They may even eat an early lunch, but less inclined to go out and get breakfast. Or if they do, it's only a quick, convenient pastry. There's no, for anyone working at home, there's no leaving and grabbing lunch on the way to work. They're sitting at home and they're eating, or they're going to have an early lunch or a late breakfast. So looking at your menu from that perspective is, look, what's selling right now? Dispense with the things that don't work. And the thing I will say, like everything that we talk about, is what we do during lockdown doesn't have to be permanent. We can take items off the menu. We can delist them, particularly if you're using delivery platforms or takeaway, or you've got your own online ordering app. You may just remove half of your menu because it doesn't perform. And it's totally okay in this environment to take things off if they don't sell. If they don't sell, it means people aren't looking for them. So don't try and push things that might have been your popular items before just because you like them if they're not working for you. So you want to take those off. The really key thing to think about with your menu is smaller is actually better, particularly in this environment. And as Madar mentioned around managing labor with your menu, it's often about trying to run the leanest labor model possible. And to do that, you might have to take off some things from your menu, be it items that require a lot of prep, that short shelf life, particularly if you're only doing much smaller numbers, that you may not want to have long prep shifts to actually do the items. You may not want to have a menu that's made to order. As an example, you might be looking to do more pre-made things because you don't want to carry the labor as well. So really having a look at your menu and rationalizing, you want to make it as lean and mean as you possibly can to make it easier for you to serve during this kind of reduced period. And you're looking for a menu that is your best sellers. The other thing I would say is be really critical, but be really harsh around products that are low GP items. We want to look at items that are really going to deliver us a lot of profit, particularly because our cost base as a percentage is generally going to be much higher, as a percentage of our sales. So those items that we carry that we know, look, they don't make us so much money, but they're popular. We want to start to consider, should we be taking those off even for a limited amount of time? And as I say, if you take those items off for another couple of weeks or another couple of months, it's totally fine to have I'd call it a lockdown menu and an outside of lockdown menu, a menu that you can go to that's lean, mean, and just really hits the mark and is going to drive that profit, and then one that you just put back to normal. And you may have two different versions of that. Your customers 100% are going to be looking for different things. Again, if you're takeaway only, they'll be moving towards certain items versus others that are more geared towards dine-in. So again, just in the menu, just in summary. Sorry, we'll go to the right slide there. As I mentioned, smaller is better. Look at taking off the non-performing lines, things that aren't selling, particularly during with takeaway only. One thing we didn't talk about was items that travel well. Particularly if you're doing a lot of takeaway or only takeaway, find items that actually, when they get to their end destination, be it through delivery, which might be sort of 30 to 45 minutes later, or even someone taking it home 10, 15, 20 minutes after you've made it, that are actually still going to be good products. You don't want stuff that's going out there that's soggy bread sandwiches, or you've got eggs on toast and you put the eggs on the toast and things like that. So we want to remove some low GP items. And again, look at removing high prep items or making those high prep items, things that are complicated or take a lot of time or processes to put together. Think about delisting those because it's going to take the pressure off your labor. And so they're all the things we want to talk about with the menu. The next thing that we're talking about is rental. And this is probably the pain of most people's existence, and certainly has put a lot of pressure on most businesses during this last 18 months or so around the pandemic, which is the rent. I know some people have had a really tough time with their landlords. Others have had a better time. But look, it's the immovable number for most people. Whilst COGS should be a relative percentage to your sales, and labor we're looking to also have to be a relative percentage to your sales to a point. Rent is just that big fat figure that just stays there, right? And some of you are paying, multiple six figures in rent, and that's a hefty bill that you've got to pay every week, month, or whatever to try and get through a period. And some people are paying rent when their business isn't even trading, which is a really tough situation to be in. The good thing about rent, and also obviously for those in Australia, and when you're in lockdown, is the government has actually the federal government's put in the national code again. Now we're talking about where are we? End of August 2021. So they've reinstated the national code to deal with rent, which is fantastic news because at least it sets a framework. It puts a really clear guide for landlords and for tenants in commercial premises to actually have a conversation around rent. The one thing I will say, though, is certainly in our experience, and a number of our clients are actually getting better deals than what the national code stipulates. So you'll need to jump online and just have a look at the national commercial or the national retail tenancy guidelines. We'll drop a link actually in the comments after the video where you can find that resource. But you want to go and find those to understand what the rules are. But as I say, some of our clients are actually getting better deals where the landlords are actually giving them 50% off the rent for a period of time. Some to the end of the year, some for a couple of months, whatever that kind of looks like. The fallback position is obviously the national code. The thing I will say about rent as well is like anything, like any conversation with the landlord, it's a negotiation. And in a negotiation, you do not want to give away all your cards. So don't go to the landlord and say, hey, look, I want to have a conversation about rent. Let's just go with what the national code says, because you actually could be in a worse position than what the landlord's willing to offer you. So firstly, you're going to approach if you haven't already had those conversations with your landlord, highly recommend that you be proactive. Go to approach the landlord or leasing agent or whoever you deal with and say, we need to have a conversation about my rent. My revenue has dropped. How do we want to approach this? Get them to actually come to you with a position first, so that you understand, well, what's your negotiating position. If they come along and say, hey, look, we're willing to give you 50% off as a rental abatement, and you don't have to pay it back, and you're only going to pay 50% for the next few months, you'd be happy days. That's the best deal that you're going to get. If they say, no, look, we're not interested, you're going to go, well, actually, we're required by law to have this conversation, or required by law for the landlord to have that negotiation. And then these are the stipulations, these are the rules that the federal government's actually set out to have that conversation and the structure. One thing for those of you who don't know, landlords now are actually given an incentive. So they get up to $3,000 a month if they give you a reduction in rent. So that's really good news for them. That may equal the reduction that they give you. So they've got to apply for that, but they're actually getting some money. Now, if they give you a rental abatement that's beyond that, that's fantastic. Again, there's some assistance there for landlords. So just covering that off very quickly. Again, talk about the national code. So you really want to know your rights. Like any legal conversation, know your rights before you go into it. As I say, be proactive in your conversations with the landlord. Don't wait for them to come to you, because you may be waiting forever. And lastly, as I say, it's a negotiation. You do not want to reveal all your cards. In any negotiation, let the landlord lead first, and then you're going to counter. And I'd keep having that conversation. The great thing about this period of time is landlord can't actually kick you out. So they do. There's no. They can't kick you out at all during the lockdown. They need to be proactive. They can't kick you out for not paying rent, certainly if you're paying a percentage of that. So the focus is really around having proactive conversations with that. And so just looking in summary, after we've had the rental negotiation, so we've looked at our business model, we've looked at our labor model, mapped that out, we've looked at the menu, we've then gone into the rent and been proactive about that and negotiated our rent down. The last thing we want to do is looking at the overhead costs for the business. So Medar, do you want to talk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that, Dom. And see, the overheads it's the last on the list, but the overheads is the one that's usually the longest, right? Because it's got all those 1%ers, 2%ers that add up, becoming quite a significant number depending on the style of business that you are in. Now, our approach to overheads right now, given we're in lockdown, is literally, there's a system we use which is called the ZBB, which is literally a zero-based budgeting. Let's assume that all your costs in your overheads have to go. That's the approach that you've got to have to take with it. So imagine every single line item has to go. And for that to actually come back onto your P&L needs to have a very significant reason on why that's necessary. So let me talk you through that process. So for example, if you draw a red line through every single line item, let's assume you have a red line that you have drawn towards electricity. Now, obviously you can't operate without electricity, so you'll need to have electricity back in there. However, what you need to be doing is making sure that you're speaking to your broker, you're speaking to your to electricity provider and trying to get a deal out of them, right? So everyone's in negotiating sort of conversations these days. every single supplier will negotiate. You just have to make sure that you're putting the attempt, you're actually going in and having those conversations. The worst that's going to happen is you're going to get a no, right? But you're going to have those conversations. So they look at every single line item. Literally, if you have to draw the red line, look line by line, to the extent that if you're not having a conversation with someone, you're not getting a deal. And if you're not getting a deal, then it's not actually getting into your P&L. And that's how you've got to treat this. Yeah. You've got to reconsider all non-essential items. So think about items where you can potentially not require them whatsoever. So in certain cases, you could have your telephone lines, in case that's something that you don't necessarily require, or the number of telephone lines that you have. Think about maybe potentially reducing number of lines that you have. Think about the pause, number of pause systems that you have in place. If you've got 6 different pause devices, then think about just having potentially 2. And the others can probably be delisted for the moment, and negotiate with your pause supplier in reducing the licensing fee that comes alongside with it. Look at your internet. Now, obviously, you require internet because you need to get orders online, but renegotiate again with your landlord, or with your with the internet provider in regards to what relief they could give you, or are there any discounts that are available right now. The other popular one that we've seen some really good wins is rubbish disposal or garbage disposal. Speak to the company that comes and picks that up off you. They might not necessarily require to come in once or twice a week. They can potentially reduce that run, which reduces their cost, because you wouldn't necessarily have the amount of rubbish as you did prior to lockdown. So think about all these areas that's not required at all. Cleaning is another one as well. So think about the amount of cleaning that's required. Your venue is not operational at full capacity. You don't have customers coming in and dining. So see if you can bring that in-house, or if there's a company who's doing it for you, then drastically reduce the amount of times they're coming out and doing the cleaning, for your venue. And the way you have to think about this is, we are actually in a temporary state right now. This will end. It's about making sure that we go through this process with a temporary mindset. So if things are required in the future, then we can bring them back again. But right now, given where things are, given where revenue is, given that we are in lockdown, given that cash flow is the biggest thing that we require, literally draw a red line through every single line item, and really have to justify why that line item needs to come back onto the P&L. Hopefully that gives you an understanding of how to treat this. Again, ZBB, zero-based budgeting. Think about it as you literally have no budget on this, and how is it that you can start bringing the costs back if you can justify where this needs to be. So just to summarize that, look at all your line items on your overhead costs, right? It's time to reconsider all non-essential spend in the business. Renegotiate all your current essential expenses that are required to operate the business. And lastly, nothing's permanent. Like, delist every single item for now. Reconsider once trade is back. So hopefully you've sort of found that useful. And so to just summarize, what we've been speaking about, in our 5 rules is, start with your current business model. What does that look like? Map out what your break-even number is. Jump onto our website, go to the tools section, and use the calculator over there, so you understand what is it, the current revenue, what your break-even needs to be. From there, get onto your labor model, understand what your labor model can afford. Use the calculator for figuring it out, number of hours that you require to operate. From there, try and work out what your menu is, and what menu you can operate with the current labor model that you have. From there, go and renegotiate your rental obligation. And then lastly but not least, go through every single line item on your overhead costs in your business, because these all add up. They are the 1% and 2%ers that, trust me, once you put together, it's sometimes a very, very significant number that could pretty much mean you making money or not making money in this sort of scenario. Hopefully you've sort of found that useful. Again, if you're watching this late, or if you have joined in just now, we are speaking about how to run a profitable venue during lockdown. You can watch this in the replay as well. You've missed out quite a bit of content. Again, we're going through five essential rules, and if you follow the 5 rules, you will be in a much better place than you were or you currently are. And yeah, if there are any comments, any areas that you found that you have done, or things that you have done that actually help you out of lockdown, or those few tips that you have, absolutely share them. And we would love to know what those are. And so that actually ends up going to the wider community as well. Our next broadcast is again next week. We'll be doing around the same time. If there are any certain areas that you want us to talk about, or if you want us to talk about certain aspects we spoke about today in detail, just let us know what they are, and we'd love to do a workshop on them as well. Again, if you found this useful, and absolutely share this with people who you reckon would find it useful as well. And yeah, what we are doing though before we sort of end is, I know all of this can be quite overwhelming, intimidating at times as well when you are looking through your numbers. And sometimes we just need a plan. We need to understand, what does a plan look like? I need to map this out before I can go and execute. Most of us in hospitality are people who execute, right? We love going and executing and doing things, but it's always the planning part which is always the massive barrier. So what we are offering is we're offering a complimentary 30-minute session over the phone, where we actually help you plan out what your next actions need to be, just to get you out of lockdown, just to make sure that you're able to break even, or at least walk away with the least amount of loss. And yeah, so again, no strings attached. Just let us know, drop in a DM, and we'd love to just jump on the phone just for a complimentary 30-minute session. And yeah, I think hopefully you found this useful. Definitely jump on to our Facebook group. Again, it is Cafe and Restaurant Owners. You'll find us on Facebook. And yeah, we do have quite a few conversations over there. And again, on our website as well, kitchencollectivecoaching.com.au. Use those tools. Those tools are absolutely vital. That's where you get started on. So again, in the tool section, the resources, you have those two calculators. And hopefully you found this useful. Again, if any questions, drop in the comments and we'll get back to you in the next few days. But again, this is it for us for now. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.